They said they didn't need me at the wedding. Just like that. A family event I helped make possible without me. It came in the form of a group text. "Hey guys, just finalizing the head count for the wedding. Zach and I agreed it's going to be a small thing. Just close friends and immediate support. Hope you understand." And that was it. No personal message, no phone call. Nothing acknowledging the years I spent holding our family together while they lived their lives freely. I sat on my porch that morning, coffee untouched, hands shaking as I read the message again. Emily had sent it like she was asking me to pass the salt at dinner. Casual, light, as if I weren't the one who'd bathed our mother when her cancer left her too weak to stand. As if I hadn't sacrificed half a decade for this family. The rage came slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a bitter heat climbing up my neck. I waited for a follow-up message. Maybe something more personal, some version of course you're invited, Hannah, we just thought..." But it never came, I replied. "So I'm not invited." No one answered. Not for hours. Then Zach chimed in. "Emily and I talked about it. We just don't want things to be tense. It's her big day." Tense. That word cut deeper than any insult. What had I done to be considered tension at my own sister's wedding? For a while, I stared at my phone, heart thudding so loudly it drowned out the birds and wind. I scrolled through old pictures on my camera roll, Christmases we'd shared, birthdays I'd organized, hospital rooms I'd cried in alone. And now, suddenly, I was unnecessary. It's not that I wanted to be the center of the event. I wasn't expecting a toast or a tribute. I just thought I'd at least be allowed in the room. Later that night, I called Emily. She didn't answer. I left a message, my voice trembling but composed. "I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I hope one day you'll understand what it feels like." She texted back not even an hour later. "It's not personal. We just want things to feel light and happy." Not personal. How is erasing someone who raised you not personal? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw our mother's face, pale in pain but grateful. She'd say, "You're the strong one, Hannah. You keep this family whole." I kept thinking, did she get it wrong? In the days that followed, I tried to talk myself out of the hurt. Maybe they just wanted a different vibe. Maybe I had been too controlling, too tired, too resentful during Mum's last years. Maybe they saw me as a symbol of all the heaviness they wanted to forget. But even then, even if all that were true, didn't I deserve more than a group text? The silence was louder than any scream. No one checked on me. No one asked if I was okay. It was as if I'd already been removed from the family portrait, cropped out without a second glance. I wandered through the house we'd grown up in, now mine technically since Mom had passed. Each room held a piece of us. The dent in the hallway from Zach's skateboard, the corner in the kitchen where Emily used to sit and sneak cookie dough. I kept waiting for the memories to bring comfort. Instead, they burned. And still I didn't cry. Not really. A tear here and there, but mostly I was numb. Like a switch had been flipped, and I was watching someone else's life unfold. Eventually, I stopped trying to contact them. What was the point? They decided I was excess weight. And for the first time, I started to wonder what it would look like to live a life not tethered to their approval. But beneath the pain, something started to rise. Not anger exactly, though that flickered, but something more powerful. A resolve. If I wasn't needed, then I was free. If I didn't belong in their picture, maybe it was time to draw my own. And that's when I remembered something Mom had said to me a few weeks before she passed. Her voice barely a whisper, her hand weak in mine, she'd said, "If they ever make you feel like you're nothing, Hannah, don't wait for them to come around. Take what's yours. Build something without them." At the time, I didn't understand. Now, her words echoed like prophecy. So no, I wasn't invited to the wedding, but maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something bigger. I never planned to become my mother's caretaker. It just happened. One doctor's visit turned into another, then another, and before I knew it, my life had narrowed down to her pills, her meals, her pain. When the diagnosis first came, stage 4 ovarian cancer. Emily cried on the phone for 10 minutes straight. Zach said he'd come down next weekend. Neither of them asked what I was going to do. But I already knew. I was the oldest. I was the one who still lived in the same state. I was the one without a husband, kids, or a job I couldn't leave. So I moved in. I gave up my apartment, put my career on hold, and became what the hospital social worker cheerfully called the primary caregiver. She made it sound like a badge of honor. But what it really meant was no sleep, no privacy, and no rest from watching someone you love dissolve in slow motion. The first few months were manageable. Mum was still herself, sharp, funny, proud. She hated the word sick, and she never let me do more than necessary. She'd say, "I'm not dead yet," whenever I offered to help her out of bed. But that changed quickly. The pain crept in like a thief, stealing her appetite, her smile, her sharpness. Suddenly, I was cooking 5 different things she couldn't eat, monitoring every bathroom trip, cleaning sheets, counting seconds between labored breaths. I learned how to administer injections. I learned which nurses were gentle and which ones bruised. I learned how to argue with insurance companies and how to sleep in chairs. I also learned how lonely it is to be needed constantly and noticed rarely. Emily visited 3 times that first year. Each time she brought a candle or a scarf or some lavender bath salt. She'd stay for a weekend, take selfies with Mum, then vanish back to her downtown loft and leave me with the mess. Zach came less. Once for Christmas, once when the hospital called about an infection, he always brought takeout and spoke in loud, cheerful tones. "You're a saint, Han," he'd say, giving me a side hug before disappearing again. "We owe you big." But they never sent money, never offered to hire help, never stayed long enough to see the worst parts, and I never asked. Not because I didn't need it, I did. I just didn't want their pity, or worse, their guilt. Still, sometimes I caught Mum watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. Her eyes would fill and she'd whisper, "I hate that you're losing your life for mine." And I'd always reply, "You gave me life first." By the time she passed, I wasn't the same person. My hair had started to gray, my back ached constantly, and I no longer remembered what it felt like to have time to myself. But I also didn't know who I was without her. After the funeral, we sat in the lawyer's office like strangers. Emily wore a black silk dress, Zach a blue blazer too sharp for grief. I wore what I'd worn for the last 6 months, leggings, a loose blouse, and exhaustion. The will was simple, everything split equally. The house, the savings, the jewelry, the antique piano. No special mentions, no letters, just equity. I didn't expect more, but some part of me had hoped. Then the lawyer handed me a small notebook. "Your mother asked me to give this to you privately." It was a journal, leather-bound, pages creased, her handwriting familiar, but faint. I waited until I was home to open it. The first page read, "For Hannah, my anchor, my truth." I didn't have the strength to say all this aloud. I sat on the bed we'd once shared, me on top, her below, and read every word. There were entries about her fears, her guilt, her love. She wrote about the day she found out it was terminal, how she'd cried alone in the bathroom so I wouldn't hear. She wrote about watching Emily avoid phone calls, and how that broke her more than the illness. She wrote about Zach's charm and detachment, and she wrote about me, about how she didn't deserve the care I gave, how she worried I'd be forgotten, how she wished she could leave me everything but feared that would only deepen the divide between us. She ended with, "You were my light, Hannah. I hope one day you'll shine for yourself." I closed the book, shaking. For years I'd felt invisible, like the silent worker behind the curtain. But here, in her last words, I was seen. Truly, deeply seen. And maybe that changed everything. After finishing the journal, I sat in silence for hours. Her words had wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside. Like the world had tilted slightly, and the weight I'd carried wasn't mine alone anymore. But then the silence returned. The texts stopped. No one checked in. No one asked how I was holding up without her. Emily and Zach had returned to their regular lives. My name vanished from family group chats, or maybe they'd created a new one without me. Either way, the message was clear. I'd served my purpose. I began to see it all differently. For so long I believed I was the stable one, the fixer, the glue. But now I saw how easily they erased me. It wasn't just the wedding. It was the years before, every unreturned call, every holiday plan they made without including me, every time I was made to feel like I was just there. That weekend, I walked through the house slowly, this time with fresh eyes. Not the eyes of a daughter preserving memories, but of a woman waking up inside a life she hadn't chosen. There was so much of myself in those walls. Not just photos or belongings, but sacrifices. The job offers declined, the relationships that fizzled out because I couldn't leave my mother's side, the hobbies abandoned, the silence I swallowed. And for what? I sat on the back steps, watching the late spring wind tug the laundry on the line. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. If I'd said no when they asked me to stay, if I'd demanded help instead of waiting for it, if I'd valued myself even half as much as I valued them. There was no bitterness in that thought, just clarity. The journal gave me something I hadn't known I was missing: permission. Permission to see the truth for what it was. That I had been written out of the family story, not because I did something wrong, but because I made them uncomfortable. I was the reminder of the years they chose not to show up. And now that Mom was gone, they didn't need the reminder anymore. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of living a life. The estate hadn't been settled yet. Everything was in the early stages of probate. We'd agreed to wait a few months before doing anything formal. I hadn't touched the accounts, hadn't moved a single item from the house. I was still grieving, still numb. Until one afternoon, I got an email from Zach with the subject, "Re-wedding and next steps." His tone was all business. He listed what they wanted to do with the house, when we could expect a buyer, and how they'd prefer to split Mom's personal items. Emily had written a note in the thread. "We'd like to handle the division fairly. Just let us know what you want to keep, and we'll take care of the rest." Take care of the rest, it echoed in my mind like an insult. I was the one who took care of everything. And now I was a name on a thread, an obstacle to be handled. I didn't reply, not right away. Instead, I printed the will. I pulled up Mum's financial records. I met with her lawyer, and what I learned surprised me. The estate was more liquid than I'd realized. She had left behind more than a house and memories. There were investments, savings, bonds, assets that were equally mine, equally. The lawyer looked at me over his glasses, careful, kind. "You're entitled to your third," he said. "There's no need to wait. You don't owe them permission." I asked if it was legal. He smiled gently. "Perfectly. They might not expect it, but that doesn't make it wrong." Still, guilt gnawed at me. Would this be retaliation? Was I becoming like them? But then I thought of all those nights alone in the hospital, the meals I skipped, the tears I hid from my mother so she wouldn't feel worse. I thought of being told I wasn't wanted at the wedding, as if I were an afterthought. And I remembered Mum's words, "Take what's yours. Build something without them." I didn't need revenge. I needed freedom. So I made a decision. I would take what was mine. Nothing more, nothing less, and I would use it to begin again. The decision felt like a quiet kind of thunder. It didn't roar, it settled into my bones with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't doing this to get even. I was doing it because it was the only way forward. I couldn't keep waiting for my siblings to treat me like I mattered. I had to show myself that I did. The lawyer walked me through the process. It wasn't complicated. Since the estate was still in preliminary stages, and the will outlined an even three-way split, I was well within my rights to claim my share from the liquid assets, bank accounts, bonds, and a small investment portfolio I hadn't even known about. I signed the documents, transferred the funds, closed the accounts that bore my mother's name. It felt surreal, mechanical almost, but when I saw the balance in my name, I didn't feel guilt. I felt breath. For the first time in a long time, I exhaled without heaviness. I didn't tell Emily or Zach. There was no need. This was mine, legally and morally. They'd left me out of the conversation. I no longer owed them inclusion in mine. With the money in my account, I started making plans, not extravagant ones, but purposeful. First, I bought a small house in a quiet town 3 hours away, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a bit of land where the air smelled like pine and wildflowers. I paid in full, no mortgage, just peace. Oh. Then I registered for classes at the local community college. Creative writing, something I hadn't dared consider in decades. I'd always loved stories, always wanted to tell my own. Now, for the first time, I could. I adopted a dog from the shelter, a scruffy golden mutt with sad eyes and a tail that wagged like he was surprised anyone noticed him. I named him Jasper. He became my shadow, my heartbeat in the quiet. I didn't realize how much I needed something to care for that wouldn't drain me dry. Day by day, the silence around me began to change. It wasn't the hollow kind I'd lived with since Mom passed. It was stillness, intentional and whole. I painted the walls with colors that made me smile, soft greens, deep blues, warm yellows. I started sleeping through the night. I started dreaming again. Sometimes I'd sit on my new porch and think about the old house. I didn't miss it. I missed her, yes, but not the weight of that place, not the feeling of being trapped in someone else's version of duty. Here I was free. One morning I opened the journal again, letting my fingers skim across the worn pages. I stopped on a line I hadn't paid enough attention to the first time. Don't let them decide what you're worth. I read it out loud. It felt like a declaration, because the truth was, I'd let them decide for too long. I'd let their absence, their silence, and their approval, or lack of it, define my identity. But not anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't asking to be seen. I was looking in the mirror now and seeing someone whole. I didn't spend all the money, I didn't need to. I was careful. I met with a financial advisor and made smart decisions. I wasn't trying to escape. I was trying to build. Build a life where I wasn't the ghost in someone else's story. One afternoon, while unpacking a box labeled MISC, I found an old photograph of me, Emily, and Zach, kids in swimsuits, arms around each other, laughing like nothing could ever break us. I stared at it for a long time. We looked so innocent, so full of belief that family meant forever. I didn't throw it away, I didn't frame it either. I slid it into a drawer next to a stack of blank notebooks. Maybe one day I'd write about that version of us, maybe not. For now it was enough to know I remembered. And that remembering didn't mean returning. This new chapter wasn't born from bitterness. It came from the ashes of endurance. I had bent for so long. Now I was learning how to stand. There was a kind of grief in that too, saying goodbye not just to Mum, but to the person I used to be. The caretaker, the background, the afterthought. But there was something else growing in its place, something quiet and strong, me. The wedding came and went without me. I didn't ask for the date, but I knew it was getting close. The morning it happened, I woke early without knowing why. A quiet sense of finality settled over me, like something had closed without a sound. I spent that day doing ordinary things, walking Jasper, tending to the herbs in the windowsill, reading a book I kept rereading because the words made me feel less alone. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I had already mourned my place in their lives. All that was left now was silence and space. It wasn't until the following evening that the first message came. Zach texted me with one word. Seriously? I stared at it for a long time before responding, "What exactly do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. A few hours later, Emily sent me a long message filled with ellipses and forced civility. "We were shocked to hear you've been accessing accounts. We weren't even done sorting through things. I wish you'd talk to us first. This feels really out of step with how we wanted to handle Mom's memory." I read it twice, then once more just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. This was what they were upset about. Not that I wasn't at the wedding, not that they'd excluded me, but that I had quietly taken what was mine, what had been left equally to all three of us, and used it. I thought about replying with a long message of my own, listing every sacrifice, every ignored call, every day I spent changing adult diapers while they were off planning parties or going on trips. But I didn't. Instead, I wrote, "You said I wasn't needed, so I acted accordingly." There was no response after that, not immediately. Later that night, I looked up the wedding photos. I hadn't planned to, but curiosity tugged at me like a loose thread. Emily looked radiant, of course, perfect hair, perfect smile, standing in a sun-drenched vineyard, surrounded by white roses and filtered light. Zach stood beside her, beaming like the proud brother. There were a few relatives I recognized and many I didn't. The captions said things like "surrounded by love" and "wouldn't change a thing." I stared at them not with jealousy, but with a strange kind of detachment, like watching a movie I'd once auditioned for but hadn't been cast in. That world didn't belong to me anymore. Maybe it never had. And that realization didn't sting, it freed me. For years I'd believed I had to earn a seat at the table. That if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, stayed silent enough, I'd be allowed in. But now I saw the truth. Their table had always been set without me in mind. The next day, Zach called. I let it ring. Then he called again and again. By the fourth call, I answered, not out of obligation, but because I wanted closure. His voice was tight. "I just don't understand, Hannah. Why you do it like this? Why you didn't even talk to us?" I kept my tone calm. "Because I knew what you'd say and I didn't want to fight." "We could have worked something out," he said, exasperated. "No, Zach. You already did. You and Emily decided how things would go. You decided who belonged and who didn't. I just followed your lead." He was quiet for a moment, then laughed bitterly. "You're making this bigger than it is." "No," I said simply. "You made it small, and now you don't get to be surprised that I stopped fitting in it." He started to say something else, but I hung up. And then I blocked both of them. Not because I was angry, though I had been, but because I didn't want to spend another minute explaining my worth to people who treated it like a variable. I didn't want to keep negotiating for respect. I went out for a walk with Jasper that evening. The air was warm, the sky streaked with lavender. A neighbor waved as we passed. I waved back. The world didn't collapse because I walked away. It didn't shatter because I refused to be less for people who needed me quiet. In fact, it felt more solid than it had in years. And somewhere inside me, a stillness settled. Not a lonely one, a peaceful one. I had left the wedding behind, but more importantly, I had left the version of myself who waited for an invitation to belong. In the weeks that followed, the quiet became familiar. Not lonely, just different. I no longer expected the phone to buzz with check-ins. I no longer refreshed my inbox looking for some overdue apology. I had released that hope like a balloon into the wind, knowing it wouldn't return. Instead, I turned inward. I began going through boxes I hadn't touched since the move. Some marked Mom's room, others simply keep. At first, I opened them cautiously, not sure what I was ready to see. But with each layer I unearthed, memories came pouring back. Not just of her illness, but of who she'd been before it consumed her. I found a photo album tucked beneath old linens. It was one of those heavy, plastic-covered books filled with faded Polaroids and curling edges. There was Mom in her 30s, laughing as she painted a wall yellow. Zach as a toddler, his cheeks full of cake. Emily on her bike, legs too short to reach the ground. And me, always slightly apart, always watching. It wasn't sadness that filled me. It was something more complex. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by proximity to pain. Not just my mother's illness, but the kind of pain that comes from loving people who don't love you back in the way you need. Later that night, I reopened the journal. I hadn't touched it since moving, but now I felt ready. The pages still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The ink smudged where her hand must have trembled. I picked up where I left off. She wrote of regrets. Not just about the cancer, but about the way she'd parented, how she'd leaned too hard on me, assuming I'd always be there. How she'd allowed Emily's charm and Zach's confidence to blind her to their lack of depth. How she'd known deep down that I'd carry the burden because no one else would. One entry stopped me cold. I worry that when I'm gone, she'll be left holding not just grief, but resentment. That the others won't see what she gave up. That they'll rewrite the story to make themselves feel better. I want to believe they'll remember the truth, but if they don't, I hope Hannah does. I closed the journal and placed it on my nightstand. She'd seen it coming, all of it. Not just the division, but the erasure, the rewriting of the narrative that made me the difficult one, the bitter one, the one who just couldn't let go. But I wasn't bitter. Not anymore. Still, something inside me needed expression, so I began writing, not with any goal in mind, not yet, but just to give the memories somewhere to land. I filled pages with recollections of caregiving, of childhood, of the tiny moments that shaped me. Like the time Mom taught me how to sew a button, or the night she let me stay up past midnight just because the stars were out and the world felt big. Each word felt like a small reclamation. One afternoon I wrote a letter, not to Emily or Zach, but to myself, to the woman who stayed through the worst, who watched life slip away inch by inch and didn't run. I wrote about the courage it took to keep showing up, the dignity in quiet service, the strength it took to walk away without burning it all down. I folded it neatly and tucked it inside the journal. That night Jasper jumped up beside me on the couch and rested his head on my lap. I stroked his fur and stared out the window, watching fireflies blink like Morse code against the dark. I thought of my mother, of the way she used to hum when she cooked, and of how I'd forgotten that sound until just then. Healing, I was learning, doesn't come like a wave, it's more like a pulse. Steady, slow, often unnoticed until you look back and realize the bleeding stopped. I didn't need their acknowledgement. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. But I needed to remember. I needed to hold on to the truth before time softened it, before silence distorted it. So I kept writing, not for them, for me. The routine I built in that small house started to take root like ivy, slow, steady, persistent. Each day had a rhythm. Morning walks with Jasper, afternoons with notebooks spread across the kitchen table, evenings filled with quiet, simple joys. I didn't think of it as happiness exactly. It was something quieter, more stable. Peace, maybe. I enrolled in a writing program at the community college, a night class called Memory and Voice. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers, sharing pieces of myself, felt daunting. But I forced myself to show up. The instructor was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s named Lorna, with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers. She didn't ask us to write about trauma, but somehow we all did. Every class was like peeling a layer off your own skin, but it didn't hurt. It breathed. We read each other's stories aloud. Mine were raw, unpolished, sometimes too long, but the class listened. They nodded. A few cried. One woman named Sandra squeezed my hand after a piece about the night I realized my mother wouldn't recover. "That was real," she whispered. "You have something to say." It was the first time in years I felt heard without being needed. During one of the Saturday community events, I met Daniel. He was standing near a booth selling honey and handmade soaps. A carpenter by trade, widowed, soft around the edges but with steady hands and a voice that settled you. Jasper took to him instantly. He asked if I was new in town. I said yes, and that I'd come to start over. He didn't pry, just smiled and said, "Good place for it." We ran into each other again and again, at the farmer's market, at the library, outside the hardware store. Eventually, we started walking Jasper together. Then came coffee. Then dinner at a tiny diner where the waitress knew everyone's name. Daniel didn't talk much about his past. He'd lost his wife to a sudden aneurysm 4 years earlier. No kids, just a quiet grief that lived behind his eyes, familiar and unspoken. We didn't try to fix each other. We just sat in the same silence, and that was enough. At first I kept a wall up, not on purpose, it was just instinct now. I had spent so long holding space for others that I didn't know how to let anyone hold space for me. But Daniel was patient. He didn't push. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered things I'd mentioned in passing. One evening, we were sitting on my porch watching Jasper chase shadows when he asked, "Do you ever miss them?" "Your siblings?" I looked at him, then out at the trees swaying in the breeze. "I miss the idea of them," I said, "but not the reality." He nodded like he understood. "Family's complicated." "That's an understatement." I paused, then said, "I used to think I was nothing without them. that if they didn't love me the right way, I must be doing something wrong. And now I know better. But sometimes the knowing doesn't stop the ache. Daniel didn't respond with a platitude. He just reached over and placed his hand on mine, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't pull away. Later that week, I brought him a chapter I'd written, part of the memoir I wasn't calling a memoir yet. I asked him to read it, already bracing for discomfort or pity. He read it slowly, quietly. Then looked at me and said, "That's not just a story, that's survival written down." I swallowed hard. "It's messy." "Yeah," he said, "but so's life. You make the mess mean something." That night after he left, I sat alone in my room and cried. Not from sadness, but from release. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding onto the version of myself that didn't need anyone. I still didn't know where this was going, with the writing, with Daniel, with whatever came next. But for the first time, the not knowing didn't scare me. I was building something, one word at a time, one moment at a time, and maybe, just maybe, it was mine. It had been nearly 6 months since I'd heard from either of them. 6 months of silence, of space, of rebuilding. I had stopped expecting anything. That was what healing had taught me. Expectation is often the gatekeeper of pain. Then one evening, an email arrived. Subject line, "Hi." It was from Emily. I stared at it for a full hour before opening it, heart oddly calm. I didn't feel dread or curiosity, just a strange, quiet acceptance. Whatever she had to say, it no longer had the power to break me. The message began politely. She said she hoped I was well, that things with the house had been progressing slowly. Then she said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how we handled things. I know we hurt you. I don't know if there's a right way to say sorry for that, but I am. I was overwhelmed, and I let convenience guide my choices." You didn't deserve that. I read it twice. There were no justifications, no backhanded explanations, just a hesitant kind of apology, acknowledgement. She went on to say that she and Zach had argued about the money, that it caught them off guard, that for a while they felt betrayed, but the more time passed, the more she saw it clearly. You didn't take anything that wasn't yours. We just didn't want to see you as someone separate from us. That's what made it so easy to leave you out. You'd always been the one holding us together. She ended with no request, no invitation, just a simple line. "I hope you're okay. I hope you're finding peace." I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing to say just yet. Maybe in time, but not now. A week later, Zach called from a number I didn't recognize. His voice, when I picked up, was taut, too controlled, like someone forcing calm. "I guess you got Emily's email." "I did." He hesitated. I don't understand why you had to go about it the way you did. Why you didn't tell us you were taking the money. Why it had to be so final." I kept my voice steady. "Because it was final. You made that choice when you told me I wasn't needed." He let out a slow breath. "We didn't mean it that way. But that's how it was," I said. "You can't erase that just because it's uncomfortable now." There was silence on the other end. Then a quiet. "We didn't think it would hurt you that much." "I know. That's the problem." He didn't respond to that. I added softer now. "I'm not angry anymore, Zach. I'm not holding a grudge. But I'm also not going back to pretending this family works the way you think it does." "So that's it?" "It has to be. For me." He murmured something I couldn't quite catch, then said, "Well, I guess I hope you're doing okay." "I am," I said, meaning it. When I hung up, I felt no triumph, no vindication, just clarity. They were beginning to understand the cost of their choices, but that didn't mean I had to let them back in. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation. That night, I sat down and wrote again, this time about boundaries, about choosing your own peace, even when it looks like betrayal from the outside. About how sometimes healing means letting go not of the pain, but of the people who caused it, even when they offer an apology. Daniel and I had dinner that weekend. I told him about the email, the call. He listened without interruption, nodding slowly, then asked, "Do you want them back in your life?" I thought about it, truly thought. I don't know. Maybe someday. But right now I just want space to live without defending who I've become. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair." We sat in silence for a while. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. "I think you're doing better than you realize." Maybe I was. The old version of me would have tried to fix things. Would have responded right away. Tried to rebuild something broken out of pieces that no longer fit. But this new version, she understood that not every fracture needs mending. Some need honoring and then letting go. I didn't need their closeness. I had my own wholeness now. The first time I shared a piece of my writing publicly, I was terrified. It was a short essay, part memoir, part reflection, about caregiving and the invisible weight of sacrifice. I posted it on a small blog site for adult caregivers, thinking maybe a few people would read it and move on, but they didn't. Within days, comments began appearing. Strangers wrote to say they saw themselves in my words. A woman in Ohio said it felt like I had written her own unspoken pain. A man in Vermont shared how he'd quit his job to care for his father, and no one in his family had ever said thank you. The words I had once hidden were now mirrors for others. I didn't expect what came next. An editor from a niche caregiving magazine reached out, asking to republish the piece. I said yes, heart pounding. When it went live, the emails poured in. People weren't just reading. They were connecting. My story wasn't just mine anymore, and somehow that made it lighter. I kept writing, not just about caregiving, but about grief, family, identity. I told the truth, not the polished, palatable kind, but the raw, complicated one. And in doing so, I found something I didn't know I needed. Community. They weren't my siblings. They weren't people I grew up with. But they saw me. Not because they had to, but because they'd been unseen too. Then one afternoon, I received a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Mara. She'd always been the quiet one at family gatherings, always lingering near the edges, observing. Her email was short but sincere. "I've been reading your writing," she said, "and I just want you to know, I remember. I saw what you did for your mom." I always thought it was heroic, even when no one said it out loud. I stared at that message for a long time. It didn't undo the past, but it added a thread of truth to it, a confirmation that not everyone had turned away. We exchanged a few messages after that, nothing too deep, but honest. She told me about her kids, about how distant she'd always felt from the core family, about how grateful she was that someone finally spoke the things no one else dared say. It reminded me that family is not always made of who you're born to, but sometimes of who chooses to understand you. Meanwhile, Daniel and I had become something steady, not defined by labels, not rushed. Just consistent, kind, safe. He read everything I wrote, offered gentle feedback, never made my voice feel small. We worked together on small projects. He helped build a bookshelf for my growing collection of journals. I cooked while he fixed things around the house. Jasper adored him, and so did I, though I hadn't said it out loud yet. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset through the porch screen, he turned to me and said, "You're becoming someone you were always meant to be." I didn't reply at first. I just smiled because I felt it too. Not someone new, but someone returning to herself. It wasn't just the writing or the new connections. It was the daily rhythm of peace, of walking through a house that felt like mine, of choosing who to let in, of learning how to breathe without bracing for disappointment. I wasn't healed completely. Grief doesn't work that way, but I was healing. Not because someone fixed me, but because I had stopped waiting to be chosen and chose myself instead. I published a collection of essays online, a small digital book titled Caretaker No More. It wasn't a bestseller, but it mattered. To me, to the people who found it, to the ones who said, "You said what I couldn't say." That was enough. I kept a copy by my bedside. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what I survived, of what I built. And on quiet mornings, when the light came in soft and golden, I'd sit at my desk, hand over my heart, and whisper to myself, "You did good. You're doing good. Keep going." Because redemption doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes with silence, with breath, with the quiet resolve to rewrite the ending. And this time, it would be mine. A year had passed, 12 full months since I'd taken my share, left the house, and started again. Time had softened some edges, but not blurred them. The clarity I'd fought so hard to claim was still with me, like a lantern in the distance, guiding me through the unknown. One morning, I woke early and knew exactly what I needed to do. I packed a copy of my book, printed with the dedication page that simply read, "For the ones who stay when no one is looking." I placed it in my bag, along with a small bouquet of white wildflowers from my garden. The cemetery was quiet, still. I hadn't been back since the funeral. I walked to her headstone and stood there for a while, letting the breeze wrap around me. Then I knelt and placed the flowers at the base, the book resting just beside them. "Hi, Mum," I said softly. There wasn't much more to say, not because there wasn't more in my heart, but because the silence said it all. She'd known this day would come. In her journal, in her final words to me, she had urged me to live, to take what was mine, to become something separate from their shadows. And I had. I sat down on the grass and let myself remember. Not the pain, not the resentment, but the love. The good parts. The time we made hot cocoa at 2 a.m. just because we couldn't sleep. The way she held my hand during storms. The way her laughter filled a room when she was still strong. "You were right," I whispered. "I didn't need to wait for them to choose me. I just needed to choose myself." A butterfly landed on the corner of the book, wings trembling with stillness. I smiled. I didn't stay long. Just long enough. Driving home, I felt lighter, not because grief had vanished, but because it had found its place in the story. No longer the centerpiece, just a chapter. Back at the house, Daniel was building shelves for the back room. Jasper barked once when he saw me, then went back to sunning himself by the porch. The world didn't stop because I said goodbye. It moved with me. Later that evening, I logged into my blog to post one final entry for the year. I titled it, "Full Circle." Sometimes healing looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like walking back, not to stay, but to remember and then move on. This story started with silence, with absence, with the words, "You're not needed," but it ends with presence, with knowing that I was always needed, by myself. And that's enough. When I hit publish, I didn't hope for comments. I didn't wait for validation. I just let it be. Because some stories don't need applause. They need peace. And peace is what I'd finally found. So if you're still listening, if you've come this far, I want to say this to you. You are not invisible. You are not replaceable. If you've had to walk away from people you once would have done anything for just to save yourself, that is not failure. That is courage. That is reclaiming your life. And if my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing. I share these truths not for drama or pity, but because stories like ours deserve to be heard, yours included. And before you go, click the next story waiting on your screen. It's one that continues this journey, a path of healing, of strength, of building something new from the pieces others left behind. Thank you for walking with me. Until next time.